Boris Sheiko was an Olympic lifting and powerlifting coach, and he's known for having one of the most impressive winning streaks in the history of powerlifting.
While he was the coach of the Russian team, the team went undefeated in world competition for 7 years. And he has coached 39 world champions.
He gained popularity sometime in the last decade with the rise in popularity of powerlifting and the eagerness of new lifters to get a handle on what constituted good, formal, sport-specific powerlifting training. It also helped that Boris Sheiko came out of the Soviet system, which has kind of a romanticized role in Western culture. They are very formal, very calculated, very top-down in their approach. And because of that, their methods look very different than what we tend to do, because Western culture was a lot more influenced by bodybuilding and sports where training could be a lot more informal, a lot more intuitive. Western culture tends to focus a lot more on the amount of work we do in a particular workout, particularly revolving around effort, how hard we work, max effort, top sets, ball breaking, back off sets, getting into the weeds, getting close to failure. And we also emphasize progressive overload in the form of regular jumps in weight and the amount of work that we do from workout to workout. So that reflects progressive overload, which is extremely important and effective when it comes to gaining size and strength. But it's also a little more of a dumb, blunt tool. When you look at Sheiko's programming, you see that there is a lot of attention paid to the recovery and that he's not so interested in having something that looks really symmetrical and clean on paper. There aren't cutesy progressions that are very intuitive when you look at them. You have to constantly refer back to the charts in order to make sense of what's going on. You have to constantly be looking under the hood. So the important thing to know is that Sheiko started out as a weightlifting coach. His powerlifting programming is essentially weightlifting principles transferred directly onto powerlifting. And Olympic weightlifting came up as a sport over the last 100+ years, right next to track and field, gymnastics, and other Olympic sports. And it was treated very much the same. Any time spent in the gym doing the Olympic lifts was time spent refining a skill. So you had to set the threshold at an appropriate weight and an appropriate level of difficulty to refine the skill. And then you had to assign an amount of work with those practice touches that would cause an adaptive stress. Then they kept track of how often you could repeat those workouts before you had to back the work off, before you had to undulate into something different. And then they came up with methods for predictably rolling these workouts forward in a way that increased skill and increased strength and didn't burn out the lifter. Remember, programming is a balance between an adaptive stress, a stress that's good enough to cause you to grow, but also recovery methods that don't cause you to get burnt out. It's easy to go into the gym and do something that causes a positive result, but you can't do that indefinitely long term. You have to balance that out with the throttle that keeps you from getting into the weeds, burning out, and having your numbers backslide if you don't get injured. Now, I think there is a benefit to having these kind of cutesy progressions, like wave loading is a very clean, easy to follow thing. Think of 5-3-1, progressing over a couple of weeks, resetting, building back up a little heavier. It addresses the recovery aspect, but it's also simple enough that the average person can make sense of it. So in that way, it's more appropriate for somebody who's newer or more recreational, handling their own programming. But if you do want to get strength specific and milk everything out of your training, then it might be worth your time to get a handle on these principles so that you can eventually apply them to your own training. Quick shout out to Barbell Apparel for sponsoring this channel. Go to barbellapparel.com/Bromley for 10% off of the best training gear on the market. You will not regret it. So let's take a look at an example program. This is in the back of his Powerlifting Foundations and Methods book that Mike Israetel translated some years ago. It's available on the RP store. It's available, I think, on Sheiko's store and on Amazon. I strongly recommend you guys pick it up. I'll put a link below. So let's take a look at an example program. We have a deadlift emphasis program. So we're starting out day one, squatting and benching, high frequency programs. You are usually going to see upper and lower body workouts done in the same session. Then he follows it up with smaller isolation work for smaller groups. He has direct pectoral work. You know, this is a guy that trains the best in the world. He doesn't turn his nose up at chest flies. It's a relevant muscle. It deserves specific attention, especially if it's a weak area. Tricep work, hyperextensions, delt work, lats. This is very common to finish up the workouts. It's also very easy to do for the prescribed amount of work. It feels like nothing after you've survived the meat and potatoes of the workout. Now, this is more typical of what normal Sheiko sessions look like. It's very common to see the same exercise done, maybe with another variation, but done later in the workout. So here he has you start with deadlifts, you go on to bench press, you go back to deadlifts. Really creative way to sneak in a lot more work. It's very hard. I've known people that have ran this workout, and it's psychologically taxing because we have this mentality that we're bred with, that we get through it, we do the work, we kill ourselves, and we move on. So to go back to it, it takes a little something. It's easy to want to take your ball and go home or to call it good, but you'll notice when you go back to this work how it's much more challenging than it seems. Also, we got to pay attention to the percentages and the sets and reps, because it's misleading. The RIR, the reps in reserve, is going to be very high here. This amount of frequency, this skill work, can only be done if you are staying away from failure. And this is one of the reasons why I push back so hard when you have high intensity idiots making claims like you can't grow unless you train to failure. That's just patently false. This isn't hypertrophy specific, but people that grow from these programs develop plenty of muscle, and they do it without getting within a square mile of failure on anything because they're not willing to risk breakdown. Most of the work that Sheiko prescribes, almost all of it, is 85% or under with lots of reps left in the tank. So deficit deadlift, you have 50% for a triple, 60% for a triple, 65% for 4 sets of 2. Nothing, easy peasy. 65% for doubles, are you kidding me? That's absolutely nothing. But when you run them for 4 sets, take a break, go through your bench work, and then come back, now you're deadlifting off boxes and you're hitting triples all the way up to 80%, a double at 85, a single at 90%. So that's a taxing workout. Imagine hitting 90% of your deadlift off blocks after doing all this work. And this is another reason why you're not going to see as lifters crap out going into the deadlift. It's not like Western lifters who end up doing their pet lifts. They end up getting very lazy with their workouts. They end up leaving things that they don't have interest in. They end up taking too long of rest periods. They end up skipping out on volume. When you run your workouts like this, the 9 singles you hit in a meet over an 8-hour day is nothing. So we know what a typical workout looks like. It's going to be a couple of compound movements, variations of the power lifts, alternating upper and lower, often repeating the first movement again later in the workout, and then doing a little bit of easy isolation work. Now, to understand how Sheiko handles recovery, you have to look at what he focuses on in his workouts. He labels his workouts as being small, medium, or large, and that's by tracking the total number of lifts that are done. So a very large workout is going to have a lot of lifts. Volume's going to be higher. It's not necessarily that you're doing any more effort. It's not that you're hitting a heavier percentage or that you're going balls out. It's just you do more work. And this amount of work, again, even though it's relatively easy, it wipes you out. It affects you. So you recover from that by alternating between small and medium workouts. And in that way, you continue to get frequency. You continue to get those touches throughout the week, but you're undulating the amount of work so that you can actually recover. So looking at this example, we have the first 4 weeks of a block, and these are small, medium, and large workouts. So you see the first week, let's say this is Monday, Wednesday, Friday. The first workout is going to be small, not a lot of lifts. Then you do a medium workout on Wednesday, small workout on Friday. By the time you jump to week 2, you're doing 2 medium workouts. So volume is already increasing. You're already starting to adapt to the amount of work. Then you go into weeks 3 and 4. You're handling these large workouts. Now you're off to the races. Now you're in the period of training after you've gotten your feet wet, where you're going to stress yourself enough to grow. You've developed a basic amount of capacity, and now you're putting it into practice. Going to weeks 5, 6, 7, and 8. Now look at how this grows. You're sustaining these big workouts and doing them more frequently. You have 2 large workouts in week 6, and then you dial that back a little bit, week 7 and 8. So again, it looks very randomized, but that's kind of the point of a lot of Soviet training methods, is they put a priority on a kind of chaotic approach to going forward, coming back. It doesn't follow a very clean, predictable, easy to explain method or pattern. The idea is that the kind of randomized approach fits more naturally with how the body naturally adapts. If you happen to have a couple workouts that are a little too hard next to each other, it's going to get made up in the wash, because you'll have a couple of workouts eventually that are kind of easy and allow you to catch up. Your body's good at hitting the brakes when stress is really, really high, and it's good at taking advantage of rest periods to grow. And that's kind of the hallmark of this training. So they see it as being more natural. So you're building up, number of lifts goes up, 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 and then eventually you go into this contest taper, which is exactly what you would expect. You go from large workouts to only medium workouts to only small workouts as part of your taper. And this is where you can see recovery spike, super compensation happens, you come in very, very strong. So Sheiko programs are periodized. That's important to know. You're looking at these different blocks where you are focused on different things. You start by focusing on the accumulation of all of these lifts and refining skill, and then you put it into practice by having higher percentages and applying it to the sport you're trying to do, which involves lifting with 90, 95, 100%. And then you eventually take the amount of work down, less exposure to these large workout sessions, and that causes you to recover. In this book, he gives examples of this is what a 4-day would look like. And again, you see how jumbled it is at first glance. It just looks like number soup. And then over here, we have a 5-day, which gets much more varied, much more complex. And then he gives examples of some of his favorite rep schemes. He does pyramids on almost everything, and it just makes sense as part of your warm-ups. You go 50, 60, 70%. He counts everything over 50% as being relevant to the overall stress. Might seem like nothing, but if you're doing all of these touches at 50, 60, 70% with very submaximal amounts of effort, and you modify those, if you add to them or peel them away, if you have those on the way back down of the pyramid, 70, 60, 50% at the end of the workout, and let's say you remove those, that has a real effect on your recovery ability. So it is relevant from this perspective. Pyramids are common, so you see him working up, and then he likes to do things where you might stay at the same percentage and ramp up and down the number of reps. So here he has 70% for 3, 5, 7, 9 reps, then down to 8, 6, and 4. That's a big workout. That's a lot of sets. You get up to 9 and 8 reps at 70% after all of those warm-up sets. He loves load variation, and he loves varying the reps to keep lifters on their toes, and I understand why. I think that's a productive approach. The ragged method, 70%, 3, 7, 5, 8, 4, 9, 6. And he says psychologically it's a little easier than the pyramid set. Here's an example of a mega pyramid, 50, 60, 70, 75, 80. 2 sets at 85, and then you work right back down. And again, the RIR makes it look like nothing substantial. All of that together over the multiple touches in the same workout, over the multiple touches throughout the week, it is substantial. These workouts fry you. So now we can pull the lens back, look at a bird's eye view a little bit, and see how these are supposed to roll weekly. So this is how he distributes the number of lifts. And this all comes from rigorous study over the years of keeping track of how much work athletes handled and the pattern of moving back and forth. And now they have these charts that they can reference depending on what they think is appropriate for the athlete. So this first example, this is a percentage of the monthly load based on the number of lifts. So if you have 300 total lifts per month in a particular movement, the first week, 46% of all of those reps are going to be present in the first week. So that's 138 out of the 300. That's a big week. And then you immediately drop 60, you kind of hang out at 66, then you drop even more to 36. That's one pattern of regulating the number of lifts, and there are a lot of others. Some of them will start lower and get higher. Like right here, you start at 28, go down to 15, then up to 35% of whatever that total number of lift is. And this requires a level of attention and calculation that most people just do not have the patience for. So it's easy to get lost. And this might be why it would be in your best interest to either reach out to the man himself for direct coaching, which he offers on his website, or to find one of his universal templates to get your feet in, so a lot of this guesswork is taken care of for you. I'm inclined to believe that only the most advanced athletes need to walk a very razor-thin line and work with somebody who knows them inside and out. I think the rest of us have a bit more play in the joint, so we can get away with running something a little more generalized. So that's how Sheiko runs his programs. He starts with his lens all the way out. He looks at what his training time is leading up to the next meet, and then he breaks it into his phases. And each phase, he has his charts for the total number of lifts per week within that block or phase of training. And then he takes those reps and distributes them over the previous chart where we're going small, medium, and big workouts. So a big workout in, let's say, week 4, where you're only doing 36 total lifts, that's quite a bit different than a big workout in week 1 where you're doing 138. So it's a matter of distributing everything out, and it's very rote, very mathematical. Now, the cool thing is that his training methods aren't really kept secret. It's just a matter of doing some research, reading some articles, paying attention, and buying his books. Again, I strongly recommend Foundations and Methods of Powerlifting. Fantastic book, very thorough, a lot of actionable advice in there with regards to technique and application of programming principles. He references a lot of Western stuff, like he talks about Louis Simmons and Westside in there. He talks about some of the other guys that pioneered training in the Soviet system and elsewhere in the world. So a lot of good stuff in there. But you can look through his interviews and people ask him direct questions. He gives his philosophy, his take on training. And a lot of people like to ask about what he thinks of the way the West trains. So in this interview with Greg Nuckols on Stronger by Science, a lot of Western lifters look at your training programs and immediately say it's too much volume for most lifters to handle, whereas others, myself included, have used them and had great success in doing so. Sheiko responds, it seems that Western athletes are used to training a little and pumping a lot. And I think that's true. I think the athletes you do see that do a lot of work maybe isn't very substantial work, or it's with exercises, high rep like isolation movements, more so than good quality technical work. For those athletes who are able to get through the first several weeks, it will become a lot easier going forward. I'm surprised as well by some programs I see from professionals in the USA. The volume at and above 85% is just too much. And I agree. I think there's a lot of people, especially a lot of good American athletes, that are really inclined to just go heavy all the time, and the ones that don't fall apart are the ones that become great. With confidence, I can say that my athletes could never do such loads. Perhaps our approach to taking one rep max differs. Some young Russian coaches are trying to follow these recommendations though. So it's funny because we're adopting from the Russians and they're adopting from like what they think are like the secret American methods. So, the grass is always greener, as they say. So he's even pointing out here that he sees the routine use of maximal loads, or closer to 100%, as being too much. We're like, oh my God, that's too much volume. And he's like, oh my God, that's too much intensity. And the fact is that they have trade-offs. They do something a bit different. They have different risks associated with them. And I'm sure you have to temper yourself to it over time to really be able to adapt. I am inclined to agree that something based off of 90% up on a regular basis is probably more likely to be detrimental to the athletes running it, or it's more likely to negatively affect people running it than something like volume. I think the volume can be adapted to much more easily. I don't think it comes with the wear. There's more opportunity to stay in the pocket and work on technique. So I recognize intensity can work and weight and load can work. I'm biased towards volume for most people. I think it has fewer pitfalls, and I think it's an easier dial to turn when you're trying to move your programming forward. In the same interview, in your experience, what common mistakes do you see lifters make in their training? I've said many times that lifters don't pay appropriate attention to technique. Sheiko's entire thing is technique. His textbook, he breaks down exercises to help with technique breaks. He addresses lifters by body type, what their setup's going to look like, where they might be deficient. So very big emphasis there, and that's why all of his work is so submaximal. Technique, technique, technique. Get comfortable with the movement. Live with the movement. Another is cutting too much weight. This is something I wholeheartedly agree with. It is especially unacceptable for young athletes as it interferes with normal development. I routinely get questions on my weight cutting videos from parents whose kids are either not powerlifters, usually wrestlers or in MMA. They talk about cutting weight, and I have to have these long talks like, that's not appropriate for them. You're not gaining anything. You're not giving them an edge. You're stunting them long term. That's a whole different argument, but I absolutely hate the trend of people hyper-fixating on body weights instead of doing what they're supposed to do and let the training develop them and grow them over time. So we have another interview here, ironedge.com.au. As for my programs being too hard and all the universal programs that I've written in the past and that I currently write for a wide range of athletes, I always warn that the program should be changed for each person's needs. So in no way, shape, or form is it, here's my program, this is how you should run. Which is funny because Wendler, a very westernized lifter who's a big figurehead, in 531, he says, if you change my program, don't say you're running my program. So he takes the opposite stance. Like, this is how I wrote it. This is how you run it. If you change it or tweak it, it's something else. It's not mine. I'm not accountable. And I think that's almost like a liability thing. Like, I'm absolved from responsibility if you screw with my program. But Sheiko recognizes individual changes aren't just a good idea. They're mandatory. Another very common difficulty I encounter is that many people do not use programs appropriate for their skill level, instead hoping that following a champions program will turn them into an instant champion without having to pass through the prior stages of training. I write programs for all stages of an athlete's training lifetime, but because of impatience, many people only look at the goal without really thinking about how to get there. And when you're looking at your favorite lifter and trying to follow what they're doing, you are ignoring the fact that they didn't do that throughout their entire development process. If you go back in time and look at them as a kid, you look at them as a late novice, early intermediate, to getting competitive and going up from there, you're going to see a whole host of training that was night and day from what they're doing now as a fully fleshed out elite lifter. It is a process. You have to do things that are appropriate for you. Again, the individual needs. Sheiko has novice templates. Sheiko has beginner, intermediate templates. And again, you can contact the man himself and he can write something appropriate for you. But don't put the cart before the horse. All athletes are different. The body's ability to recover differs from person to person. For example, my student Alexei Sivakon did around 3,000 to 3,500 lifts per month, while Maxime Potninij could not do more than 1,100 lifts. Lighter athletes train with higher volume and greater intensity than athletes from heavier weight categories. Jan Urasov is the junior world champion in the bench and bronze medalist in the open category in 2014 and trains 4 times per week. He is doing much more volume and intensity than Kirill Sarachev at 180 kilograms of body weight. Kirill Sarachev is an absolute monster, as you can see right here. Jan can do 2 large workouts per week. Kirill can only do 1 per 10 days. And that's very common with the strongest, biggest, heaviest athletes. Lighter athletes and less developed athletes can get away with a lot more work, and they actually should do a lot more work at higher intensities to push forward. Whereas once you get to mass monster status, once you get to legitimate levels of strength, you have to be more careful because each hard touch represents a much bigger systemic stress. And that's also one of the reasons why you're going to bias that way towards women. I don't think it's that there's anything particularly different about females in regards to, I don't know, hormones or their genetic makeup. It's just that women tend to be smaller. So those rules are going to pop up a lot more often when you're putting together an appropriate program for a female. And then I'll finish with this piece from an interview on JTS Strength and Juggernaut Training Systems. Sheiko says, it is impossible to increase volume constantly with no limit. It means we have to increase something else, and that's usually the intensity. Up to a point, you can get away with increasing both volume and intensity. For example, a beginner may perform 500 competitive lifts and special preparatory exercises in 1 month at 50 to 60% average intensity. Later on, the same athlete as a more advanced lifter could average 1,000 competitive lifts and special exercises at 67 to 69%. However, both volume and intensity cannot rise together indefinitely. At some point, you have to raise one and lower the other. That was kind of the issue I took with Ensons, is when you see how careful Sheiko was with how he undulates his workouts session to session within a week, how he undulates the weeks within a month, and how he puts those together into full macro cycles. Something like Ensons ignored that entirely and just put together something that looked surface level like a Sheiko program, and then told you to do an AMRAP at the beginning, an AMRAP at the end, and then progress it linearly indefinitely for as long as you felt like. And that goes back to the Western approaches of working, being effective, but not addressing the problems that programs like these that concern themselves with world champion development hold themselves accountable to, not addressing the problems of recovery and predictability that you need when you're operating at that level. So with Westernized style of training, we end up doing a lot of stuff that it's productive, but it's not productive indefinitely. And it needs some more. It needs some refinement. It needs some adjustment. And once you find that balance, then it's just, you're like a dog off a leash. It's just game over. So I highly recommend you get his book and you look through how he undulates the amount of work day to day, week to week, month to month to keep progress sustainable and predictable. Even if you don't follow something specifically like this, it's going to change the way that you look at training and give you a lot more tools in your belt that can help you get strong, especially when you start to run into problems. That's all I got for today, guys. Leave questions and comments in the comment box. If there's anything I didn't address, anything that's unclear, I'll do my best to answer it. A lot of this stuff gets over even my head. Or better yet, take it to Patreon, where you can get in touch with me directly. And it's where you can see me upload daily videos of my workouts with commentary, so you can see how I apply these principles in real time. Thanks for watching, guys. Till next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.